Now, Jackson was very definitely a new kind of president, and for some Americans, an exciting president, and for other Americans, a disquieting president because he was an activist president in a way that nobody had seen before. He advocated in favor of legislation. He didn't let Congress, come up with the legislation and then he would sign off on it or not. He basically went to Congress and said, in effect, this is a bill that I want you to consider. This is a policy that I want you to adopt. That was unprecedented. He was the first president to veto bills because he didn't like them. Previous presidents, starting with George Washington and all the way through, vetoed bills only when they considered them unconstitutional. So this was something new. Then he also created something called the spoils system. And the expression here is to the victor go the spoils. Now, back in the day, there was no civil service like there is today, where you have federal employees who join the civil service and they remain in their jobs year after year after year, um, you know as if they're just they're just regular employees doing regular jobs. During this period, the president had the power to appoint any number of people to certain posts. He had the power to appoint postmasters. He had the power to appoint customs agents, which is to say these were officials who were at the ports, and when cargoes arrived and people had to pay the tariffs or the customs duty or whatever you wanted to call it, there was it was Jackson who determined who was going to hold that post. And I could multiply examples almost indefinitely. Uh, Nobody had seen a president you know do this kind of thing with this kind of vigor and this kind of sort of remorselessness and a kind of a glee. And what this involved was not just you were giving your supporters these jobs, but you were also making them sort of your patrons, or you were making yourself their patron. And what you were doing was you were intensifying their loyalty to you. And so when the next election came around, you had very strong supporters, who were going to um, you know rally, mobilize the vote in the area, where they operated. So this was a big New Deal. He presented himself as a champion of the common man, and nothing intrinsically wrong with this. But previous presidents had not presented themselves as the champion of the common man. Um, Washington wasn't like that. Adams wasn't like that. Jefferson wasn't like that, and so forth. And this business of championing himself or making himself a champion of the common man came across as, oh, this guy's a demagogue. He is going to play upon the emotions and the passions of these common men. And so, he is a menace to a healthy republic. Not only do we have an emerging democracy, but now we have one of the sort of the scourges of democracy, one of the threats to democracy. Um, this isn't a bad thing, but his supporters were unusually good at mobilizing voters. The, his party, or soon became known as the Democratic Party, same party that we have today. Um, and this political party was really good at turning out the vote. They just had a knack for it, and one element of the knack for it involved having plenty of alcohol around. It's when candidates gave stump speeches and so on. So the Democratic Party was really quite good at that. And so this Democratic Party was the first political party to operate as we think of political parties today. But people who were concerned about him, he didn't seem like a president. He seemed like like a king, and people called him King Andrew the First. And this particular cartoon um, dates from the 1832 presidential campaign, and I'm going to show you a detail from it. This is down at the bottom, and you can see him, with his feet, trampling the Constitution of the United States. Again, this is an indication he was pushing his power beyond the constitutional limits of presidential power. You can also see him trampling internal improvements and the second U.S. bank, and and these were things that that some Americans, really believe the federal government should be involved in. They should be involved in, helping to build turnpikes, canals, railroads, and so forth. And Jackson opposed these kinds of things. He thought the states should be up to it. You can also see him trampling. This is a little hard to see. A book entitled "The Judiciary of the United States," and so basically he's trampling the judicial power. He's not observing that. And then, to return to a point made earlier, he is trampling the second U.S. national bank, and we'll get to that in a bit. So there we go. Okay. Now here you have the same poster again, but I'm going to show you the text, and I'm not going to read it to you, obviously, but you'll see it in PDF, format, um, and you can see that people who were opposed to Jackson in 1832, really thought of him as being, a king and a tyrannical king, at that. Well, needless to say, people who were not comfortable with Andrew Jackson needed to mobilize politically against him. And this is what led to the creation of the second party system. And the political tradition of the second party system tracked back to Thomas Jefferson in the case of the Democrats, and more or less Alexander Hamilton in the case of the Whigs. And in terms of the political convictions of the Democratic Party, they had a focus on state and local power, and they focused on limited government, and they championed, the little guy. The Whigs were more attuned to the idea of national power, and they believed in federal support for internal improvements like turnpikes, like canals, like railroads, and so forth. And they tend to be more pro business. And then, sources of support: Democrats, mostly small farmers, urban workers, immigrants; Whigs, also some small farmers, but mostly planters. And a planter um, was essentially a, a farmer who held at least 20 um, slaves in bondage. So one of my ancestors was a planter in that respect. He had 20 enslaved Americans, working for him at the time that the American Civil War ended. Now, you know, Democrats, okay, we kind of understand, where that term comes from. Well, what is this business about, the Whig Party? That sounds like a really weird name. And, where does this come from? Well, in the 18th century, uh, there were British um, politicians and political philosophers, and also American colonial political philosophers who were interested in limiting the power of the British monarch. And so, since you've got King Andrew, then it made sense to adopt, the name of the Whigs, who in the 18th century had been trying to limit the power of the British monarch. Well, these people were trying to limit the power of this American would-be monarch, Andrew uh, Andrew Jackson. Now, here we have the 1832 election. And you can see that there are four candidates here. You can see that Jackson wins a commanding share of the popular vote, and also a comfortable majority in the electoral college. Henry Clay, making another bid, the presidency, you know, comes off kind of, sort of, maybe okay, but not great. There's an independent Democrat, John Floyd, I think, who doesn't do terribly well, although he carries the state of South Carolina. And then, and this is interesting, there was a candidate, a guy named Wirt, who represented the anti-Masonic party. And during this period, you had a certain amount of concern for sort of, conspiracies. Um, Basically, nefarious forces at work to undermine the republic. And so, as Catholic Irish came in, and then there were Germans who also come in, and some of them were Catholic. There was the idea, oh my God, the Pope is going to take control of America. That these people are all going to be, loyal to the Pope, not to the Republic. And then there's a society, and probably most of you have heard of it, the Masons. And there's a secret society then, secret society, now, and there are different levels of, being a Mason, different degrees and all that. And there was a sense that what's a secret society? What's going on with these people? And it was widely believed that, these men were working behind the scenes. They were in cahoots to pull the strings of basically the politics in the United States, and were usurping the proper workings of democracy. And this is an expression of something that one historian has called the paranoid style in American politics. He wrote an essay about it in 1964. But you see that these conspiracies from time to time. The most recent one probably is is the QAnon conspiracy. But these things are like nothing new in American life. And this sort of paranoid style is like, we're not just dealing with a loyal opposition, that we can see them, we can understand them, we know what their policy positions are and so forth. But no, there are these sort of subterranean forces that are trying to subvert the healthy workings of our republic. But he actually carries Vermont. I don't know what's going on with Vermont, but he got a hold of Vermont. And if I'm looking at this correctly, 255,000 popular votes. So this particular conspiratorial view was no small thing. Nevertheless, to repeat a point, Jackson won re-election handily. Well, the Whigs now had kind of a problem because the Democrats were really good at turning out the vote, and they did it by sort of appealing to the common man, flattering the common man, saying things like, hey, there's the elites, the experts, who think they know it all, but you are a common man. And by dint of being a common man, you have common sense and better political judgment than these elites, So you have this anti-intellectualism, and you can see it, in American political life today. It hasn't died. Anti-intellectualism has been alive and well throughout the republic. But the Democrats were great at this, and so the Whigs, well, they took the view that if you can't beat them, copy them. And so here you have the 1840 presidential campaign. We'll get back to Jackson in a minute, but let's just jump forward again. So you have the Log Cabin. This is a campaign newspaper that got put out in New York and Albany. The candidate that they ran in 1840 was William Henry Harrison, a general who had won a major victory over Native Americans in the old Northwest Territory in the Battle of Tippecanoe. His running mate was John Tyler of Virginia, and this is where you get the famous expression "Tippecanoe and Tyler too." Well, Harrison, won the election, gave a 2 hour inaugural address, and then died like 30 days later or thereabouts. So, longest inaugural address in American history, shortest presidential administration in American history. So he's kind of pretty much of a footnote. But what we're dealing here is the adoption of this democratic flattery of the common man. And so hey, booze is an important factor in this. And so you've got somebody who obviously has a problem with this approach to politics, or the federal abolition Whig trap to catch voters in. What you get, the voter goes in there sipping away the hard cider, the log cabin comes down, and this person winds up voting for the Whigs. It goes on from there. A drop of hard cider or the Tippecanoe roarer, you know, um, and so forth. This gets kind of ridiculous, but it but it shows that the Whigs were trying to beat the Democrats at their own game, and the game was flattering the common man. So here we have the 1840 election finally, and you can see that again, William Henry Harrison, he's the Whig candidate, and he's up against um, Martin Van Buren, who had been Andrew Jackson's second vice president. He had two of them, and then won election on as president in 1836, but obviously, failed to gain re-election. And you can see that the Whigs did really good at kind of beating the Democrats at their own game. Um, in the Electoral College, Harrison wins 80% of that, 234 electoral votes. The popular vote, it's a little bit closer, but he still, defeats Van Buren handily. And so, again, to take this back, pull back to the second party system, you have a Democratic Party and a Whig Party. They have different ideas about their policies, but they have very strong similarities in terms of how they mobilize voters. And the way they mobilize voters is to maximize, the impact of this new Jacksonian democracy or white man's democracy.